Detectives may have gotten the break they've been looking for in a decades-old cold case in Tacoma.
Today, police announced the arrest of a man in connection with the 1986 murder of Michella Welch. KOMO's Steve McCarran has more from Tacoma, where Michella's body was found 32 years ago.
Her bike was still there. Her lunch was still there. But she was gone. That was the moment a Tacoma park stopped feeling safe. It was 1986. A 12-year-old girl named Michella Welch had gone to Puget Park with her two younger sisters. She left for a few minutes to get lunch. When her sisters came back from a nearby restroom, they found her bicycle. They found the food. They did not find Michella. 5 months later, in the same city, another girl vanished. 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian rode her bicycle into Point Defiance Park and never came home. Two girls, two parks, two bicycles left behind. 1 year. For almost 30 years, Tacoma believed one person was responsible for both crimes. Investigators later learned the truth was far stranger and far darker than anyone expected. If cases like this should not be forgotten, stay with me. This is the story of two families who waited more than 3 decades for an answer. Before any of this happened, Tacoma was an ordinary place. Children rode their bikes through the parks all summer. Parents let them go without much worry. Puget Park and Point Defiance Park were not places anyone feared. They were where kids spent their afternoons, riding trails, playing near the water, coming home when the sun went down. That sense of safety would not survive 1986. Michella Welch was one of those Tacoma kids. Her sister Nicole later remembered her as more than a big sister. She was almost like a second mother. She loved music. She loved art. She played piano and violin. She read constantly. She looked after her younger sisters without being asked, the kind of older sibling who made sure everyone else was taken care of first. On March 26, 1986, Michella took her sisters to Puget Park. At some point that day, she walked home to get lunch for all 3 of them. Her sisters left the park briefly to use a restroom at a nearby business. It should have been an ordinary afternoon. A bike ride, a walk home, lunch in the park. When the sisters came back, everything looked almost normal. Her bike was there. Their food was there. Michella was not. A search began almost immediately. Family, then police. Then volunteers moved through the park and the surrounding area. That night, a search dog found her body in a gulch near the park. Her death was ruled a homicide. The details were painful and do not need to be repeated here. Investigators recovered unknown DNA from the crime scene. But this was 1986. DNA testing existed in theory, but nothing close to what it would become decades later. There was evidence. There was no name to match it to. And so the case did not close. It went quiet, sitting in a file cabinet, waiting for a kind of science that had not been invented yet. For Michella's family, there was no waiting for the pain to arrive. It was already there. Every day without an answer was its own kind of loss. 5 months later, Tacoma faced it again. Jennifer Bastian was an avid cyclist. On August 4, 1986, she rode into Point Defiance Park, the same kind of afternoon ride she had done many times before. She did not come home. Her family reported her missing. Police shut down sections of the park in search for her. Volunteers joined in, walking the trails, checking the woods near 5 Mile Drive. For weeks, there was nothing. No sign of her. No answers for a family desperate for even one. On August 28, 1986, Jennifer's body was found in a wooded area off 5 Mile Drive, inside the same park where she had last been seen. The Green River Task Force, experienced with outdoor crime scenes, was brought in to help process the area. Investigators later said the location appeared to have been prepared before she was brought there. Her death, like Michella's, was ruled a homicide. 2 girls. 2 parks only a few miles apart, 2 bicycles left behind. Investigators could not ignore the similarities. Both victims were young girls, close in age. Both cases happened in Tacoma, months apart in 1986. For nearly 30 years, the working theory inside the department was simple. One person did this. One predator was still out there. And Tacoma parents were living with that fear every time their children went out to ride their bikes. That theory made sense with what investigators knew at the time. It would take modern DNA science to show them what they could not see back then. One name entered the file early. Robert Dwayne Washburn had called police before Jennifer disappeared, claiming he had seen a man in Point Defiance Park matching the description of a possible suspect in Michella's case. After Jennifer was killed, that call brought detectives back to him. He told police he often jogged in the park and had been there when it was cordoned off during the search. There was not enough evidence to arrest him. The case, like Michella's, went cold. So why did a man who called in a tip about one murdered girl end up connected to the murder of another? At the time, no one had an answer. That question would not be resolved for more than 30 years. For the next 2 decades, both files sat in storage. Detectives followed hundreds of leads. Names were checked and cleared. No arrest came. Meanwhile, the city carried the memory forward. Parents warned their children about the 2 parks. The murders became part of Tacoma's collective fear. The kind of story that got passed down even to kids who were too young to remember 1986 firsthand. DNA can sometimes stay on evidence for years, but only if the evidence was saved, protected, and still has something useful on it. In 1986, investigators could collect a sample from a crime scene, but they had no way to search it against a national database, because that database did not exist yet. All they could do was store it carefully and hope that someday science would catch up. For Michella and Jennifer, that wait would last most of a lifetime. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, both cases were revisited from time to time, whenever a new lead came in or an old name resurfaced. Investigators talked to former classmates, former neighbors, men who had been questioned once and cleared, men who had never been questioned at all. Each new name meant new paperwork, new interviews, and, eventually, another dead end. The 2 files grew thicker every year. The answers did not come any closer. One of those children never stopped thinking about these cases. Her name was Lindsay Wade. She was 11 years old in 1986. The murders taught her, at that age, that real evil existed in the world. She did not know it yet, but that fear would shape the rest of her life. In 2009, the Tacoma Police Department formed a cold case unit. Detective Gene Miller helped build it. Lindsay Wade, the same girl who had grown up afraid of these 2 unsolved murders, became a detective on that unit. By then, the files on Michella and Jennifer filled dozens of binders. Wade worked through them one by one. She built lists of men connected to the investigations over the years. Reports say she reviewed thousands of names and collected DNA samples where she could. This was not fast, dramatic police work. It was slow. It was reading old reports late into the evening, making phone calls to men whose names had sat in a file for decades, asking them to voluntarily give a DNA sample, waiting for lab results that could take months, eliminating one name, then moving to the next, over and over, year after year. So why did these cases take so long to solve? Because in 1986, there was DNA evidence with no name attached to it. Science had to catch up to the case files sitting in storage. And for years, that gap between the evidence and the technology was the whole reason both cases stayed open. In 2006, a DNA profile was developed from evidence in Michella's case. It did not match anyone in the available databases. Investigators had a profile. They still did not have a name. In 2013, investigators tested evidence from Jennifer's case, including the swimsuit she had been wearing. A male DNA profile was developed. Then came the moment that changed everything. Investigators compared the DNA from Jennifer's case with the DNA from Michella's case. They did not match. For almost 30 years, police had been hunting one person. Now they understood the truth. two different men had committed two separate crimes against two young girls in the same city within months of each other. The theory that had shaped the entire investigation for a generation was wrong, not because anyone had failed, but because the science that could prove it wrong did not exist in 1986. Could one old piece of evidence still change everything? In this case, it did. Twice, investigators built a new list of persons of interest for Jennifer's case. Robert Washburn was still on it, partly because of that strange early phone call he had made about Michella's case, years before he became connected to Jennifer's. In March of 2017, FBI agents found him living in Illinois. He voluntarily gave a DNA sample. On May 3, 2018, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab delivered the result. Washburn's DNA matched the male profile from Jennifer's swimsuit. One source described the odds of that match happening by chance as 1 in 57 trillion. He was arrested in Illinois and brought back to Washington to face charges. At almost the same time, Michella's case was moving too. Investigators worked with genetic genealogists, using the unmatched DNA profile from her crime scene to build out a family tree. That work pointed toward two brothers who had lived in the Tacoma area back in 1986. One of them was Gary Hartman. On June 4, 2018, detectives began watching him. The next day, Hartman went to his job at Western State Hospital, then went to breakfast with a coworker. After he left, a detective recovered a napkin he had thrown away. The lab compared DNA from that napkin to the DNA collected from Michella's case in 1986. It matched. A cold case that started with a missing lunch and an empty bike path ended, decades later, with a discarded napkin at a breakfast table. Hartman was arrested on June 20, 2018. He had never been a suspect back in 1986. He had no serious criminal record. At the time Michella was killed, he lived less than 2 miles from Puget Park. He went on to work as a registered nurse, later as a community nurse specialist at Western State Hospital. For more than 30 years, while Michella's family wondered who had taken her, the man later convicted was living nearby, working, raising a family, and appearing to live an ordinary life. Washburn pleaded guilty to murdering Jennifer Bastian. In court, he read a written statement. He was sentenced to nearly 27 years in prison. Jennifer's mother, Patty Bastian, said the guilty plea at least spared the family the pain of sitting through a full trial. Jennifer's sister Teresa said she did not believe his apology was sincere. Gary Hartman waived his right to a jury trial. In March of 2022, his case went before Judge Stanley Rumbaugh in a bench trial that lasted less than 2 hours. As part of the legal process, prosecutors and the defense agreed to certain facts ahead of time, and a rape charge was dropped as part of that agreement. The judge found Hartman guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to 26 years and 6 months in prison. Hartman apologized in court. For Michella's family, the apology could not undo what they had lost. Her mother, Barbara Leonard, remembered Michella as a happy, trusting child. Her sister Nicole, who was only 9 when Michella was killed, spoke about the nightmares and the fear that followed her for years. She talked about growing up in the shadow of that day, about the emotional walls that formed without her even choosing them. She also spoke about choosing to forgive, not because it was easy, but because she did not want the pain to keep controlling the rest of her life. Jennifer's family carried their own version of that same weight. More than 30 years passed between the day she disappeared and the day her mother and sister finally heard the word guilty. The plea spared them a trial. It did not give them back the decades they had already lost, raising the rest of their lives around a question that never went away. This case was never only about Dina. It was about two families who lived more than 30 years without an answer, and about a city that carried the fear of both murders long after most of its residents had grown up, moved on, or forgotten the exact dates. It was about a detective who was once a frightened child in the same city where these murders happened, and who later spent years of her career trying to close both files for good. Lindsay Wade once described these two cases as a black cloud hanging over Tacoma. For nearly 30 years, that cloud stayed over the city, built on a theory that made sense at the time, but was not the truth. Two girls went into Tacoma parks in 1986 and never came home. Two families waited, through birthdays that should have happened, through decades of not knowing. Two separate men were eventually identified, not by luck, but by preserved evidence, patient detective work, and DNA science that did not exist when Michella and Jennifer were killed. The cases were connected by the year, the city, the fear, and the memory that never left Tacoma. They were never connected by the same hand. What this case leaves behind is bigger than two convictions. It shows that cold cases can still move even after 30 years if the evidence was protected and someone refused to stop looking. It shows that assumptions made with the best information available at the time can still turn out to be wrong, and that the willingness to test that assumption again, decades later, is what finally gave two families their answer. A detective who was once a frightened 11-year-old girl in Tacoma grew up to help close both files. A napkin thrown away at breakfast helped end a search that started with a bicycle left on a park path. Michella Welch and Jennifer Bastian were 12 and 13 years old. They had families who loved them, sisters who remember them, and lives that were only just beginning. For more than 30 years, Tacoma waited to understand what had happened to them. In the end, the truth was not one story. It was two. And after 3 decades, both of them were finally told.